Hey, Steve, how you doing this week?
Good, Eric. How about you?
Doing pretty well. And you know what? Hopefully this isn't a situation that you as a landlord are dealing with right now, but it wouldn't be surprising because we have found more and more, and I'll say that again, more and more people bringing up issues with pets and their tenants.
Yes. More specifically, how to classify them, whether they're pets or if they're an emotional support animal or a service animal or exactly what that animal does, what type of enjoyment or purpose that they bring to your life.
So let's roll some intro music here. Well, let's get it going, and we will dive into this topic coming up next.
Welcome to the RentPrep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Okay, so Steve, you wrote a really nice blog post on this, and that's kind of, if you're watching the video, that's where we're looking at right now. But I wanted to go over kind of the difference between support animals. So, if you have a tenant and they come at you and they say, hey, this is a service animal, what are they saying?
They're saying this is a service animal and I have rights and your pet policy means nothing to me. That's basically what they're saying.
So from reading your blog post that you wrote, and this is a couple of years ago you wrote this, basically a service animal typically is just a dog, right? It's, a seeing eye dog, or maybe somebody has a disability and they need that dog. But I found it interesting. It can actually be a small horse as well.
Sure. Why not? Yeah.
Do you know what the backstory is on that?
Somebody had to have owned a small horse and trained it, and then that became, that's the only logical explanation. Because I did the same thing when I read that and kind of chuckled and said, a mini horse? How would that?
A minotaur.
Yeah. All right. Sure.
So I think it's important, though. The reason that we're doing this podcast is it's a topic that keeps coming up more and more. And I think part of it is because tenants are becoming more and more educated on what they can do. So when it comes to a service animal, you're probably not going to run into this issue quite as often because you know what? If somebody's blind and they have a seeing eye dog, they need a service animal. That's something that, as a landlord, you should be accommodating for. Obviously, they have an issue. But I think the thing that kind of rubs landlords the wrong way sometimes is they run into issues where they have a tenant who has, a mongoose. And they're like, no, that's not a pet. That's an emotional support animal. So an emotional support animal is an entirely different animal.
It is. It can be a bird. It can be a cat. It can be a dog. It can be.
I thought you were going to say a plane there.
Yeah, I mean, if
a bird, a cat,
right,
plane.
Well, I wouldn't be shocked. Eventually, planes show up on here. I'm a bit jaded, and it may come across that way. And here's the reason why. And I agree, there may be a tenant who has a legitimate need and has a genuine reason to have a emotional support animal. Okay. And I don't mean any disrespect to them at all, but from the perspective that we hear about this consistently, it's the landlords who are dealing with this, who feel like they're being strong-armed into having to allow pets or animals, I should say more specifically, in a situation that they're not comfortable with. They're not comfortable having it. And so many times, like in the Facebook group that we have, you'll hear a landlord give you a horror story about they rented to somebody with a dog and the dog destroyed the hardwood floors and it took them a month to get the smell of urine out of the apartment, or the dog destroyed everything outside, or whatever the case is. But it was clearly a situation where they've chalked it up as lesson learned, no more dogs. And now they've got a new tenant coming in saying, no, I don't care what your pet policy is. I don't care about what your previous experiences were and how horrible they were. It doesn't matter. My situation's different and you need to respect that. And that's a tough thing for a landlord to just take on the chin and say, okay, yeah, maybe you're right, and I do have to accept this.
Well, let's talk about what a landlord can and can't do. All right, so I think it's a little bit more common knowledge, and it's becoming more common knowledge that if you do have a situation where it is classified as an emotional support animal or a service animal, you should not be charging something like a pet policy or having a pet policy where you're going to charge like an extra security deposit because of that animal. That is not considered a pet; it's considered an emotional support animal. So that right there, if they do have the proper documentation, do not do that. You're going to get yourself in some hot water. But there are things that you can do, right? So looking at our notes here, one of the things, if it's an emotional support animal, you can look at your insurance company and you can see, are there certain breeds of that dog that your insurance company is like, we're going to drop you if you have that. So that's one thing you could consider.
Yeah, and there's a reason why. So basically, at the end of the day, there's a couple of, I don't know if I want to call them loopholes, but more provisions than anything that say, okay, even though you do have to accept these animals, there are some situations that would be considered unreasonable. And by the letter of the law and the fair housing, specifically, it classifies them as undue harm to a landlord. And in a case where you have to prove undue harm, losing your insurance policy is a great example. If you accept this person or this tenant who has a pit bull for an emotional support animal, and your insurance policy has a restricted breed clause in there that specifically says you cannot have pit bulls on the property, you can't allow that because it's going to cause you to lose your insurance, regardless of whether that's the person's emotional support animal or not. So that would be a good case of undue harm. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is the first catch for landlords to be aware of.
Well, let's say that you have an inkling that you think that this tenant's just trying to pull one on you. You don't think that maybe this is really an emotional support animal. Did this person really get that ferret because, they're having trouble sleeping at night? So what is one of the first steps you can do if that's maybe your suspicion?
Well, first and foremost, keep that suspicion to yourself because you're in some dangerous hot water if you articulate that and verbalize that to a tenant and say, I don't think that this is legit. I don't think you need a cat or whatever.
Well, why is that? Because essentially what you're doing is you're calling them out on a disability.
Yeah, you're discriminating. You're potentially discriminating against them, saying, I don't believe what you're saying to me. And whether or not you feel that or not, just don't articulate that because then you're getting yourself into a situation where you're denying them based on that, and it may be a legitimate need that they have and a documented need that they have, and now you're automatically wrong as a landlord. So you can think and feel those things. We all do at times, for sure.
Sure.
Just don't verbalize them or articulate them to the applicant or the tenant.
Well, according to your blog post you wrote on this, you said that you can request a written statement from a healthcare provider confirming the tenant's disability and the nexus of a companion animal, and confirmation that that its presence will ease the disability.
I'm going to use a really crude example, but it's a great way to just make the point.
You've got my attention.
So as a landlord, you don't want to say, why do you have a dog? Because you're blind? You cannot ask what their disability is. Crazy as that might even seem, even if you're putting it in the most respectful way, you cannot make assumptions or even ask about that person's disability.
Which is awkward because I think the human condition is curiosity, right?
Sure.
You're going to be curious.
Yeah.
Like, if somebody's got a service animal, I know if I see somebody walking one on the street, it catches my attention and you're curious what the situation is. I think you kind of got to quelch that curiosity and make sure that you're not asking an inappropriate question to somebody about a disability.
Yes, and you have to be very cautious because some may be obvious. The person's blind and they're throwing off all kinds of signals that they're blind. They're wearing glasses or they have a walking stick. Who knows? But what if it's an animal that detects seizures? That person may not look disabled in any way whatsoever and may live a completely normal life and not be on disability and not have a handicap sticker on their car and not throw off any of the typical signs that say this is somebody who's legitimately disabled.
So in that case, you can request from that person a written statement from a healthcare provider, but you can't say, hey, what's the deal? You seem like you're fine to me. Like that's where you start getting yourself into, a bad situation.
No question about it. You want to also make sure that the animal itself is good to go.
Okay.
You want to make sure the animal's up to date on its immunizations. You want to make sure the animal doesn't have any issues that you need to be aware of because regardless of that animal's status, at the end of the day, even if it's a service dog, right, for a blind person, let's say, if that dog just bit somebody at a previous place and that dog is now being known as or classified as a problematic animal, you don't want to take on that issue either. So you want to make sure that you're following all the steps and just making sure, is there a nexus between...
And that just means like a connection?
Yes.
Yeah.
So is there a nexus? And people who have an emotional support animals would get this typically from a therapist or somebody that can say, you have anxiety, or you have depression, or you have something that I can categorize and capture. And now as a treatment for that, we're saying that a dog is good because it lowers your heart rate and your blood pressure, or a dog takes that stress away, or a dog may help you with the PTSD. And again, I don't mean to make light of this because I know plenty of people with PTSD, and serving in the Marines myself, I feel like I have an understanding and a respect for that specific diagnosis, that I get it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a tough thing because not just as a landlord, but as a person, I feel like you meet somebody and you want to judge them and know their whole life story just from that brief interaction you had with them. And you're like, this is just a scummy tenant who's just trying to pull a fast one and wants to get a pet, even though I say no. But there could be a backstory there that you're unaware of. So, I mean, there's really two reasons why you don't want to bring up the disability directly. It's because, you know what, just be a little sensitive to them too.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate. It's that classic case of one bad egg ruins the bunch. You know what I mean?
Because it does happen, yeah.
Yeah, there are those horror stories out there. There are people who abuse it.
I think one of the things, too, that's worth mentioning is sometimes these cases can get pretty specific. So in our RentPrep for Landlords Facebook group, which if you search it on Facebook, you can request access and you can join. We had somebody ask a question and they said, well, this is a multi-unit. This person has a emotional support animal that wants to move in, but the people upstairs, the daughter has a severe allergy, and they're worried that it's going to cause undue harm to the daughter upstairs. What do you guys think? And you know what I told her? I said, I think you need to talk to an attorney because sometimes these situations in these cases can be very specific, and it's hard to read through all the lingo and, your state laws and what's going to apply and what won't, hold up in court.
Yeah, for sure. And again, you can get really into the weeds. You can just get to a place where an attorney might be the best answer for you, because even if you're right, it doesn't mean that you're going to avoid a potential lawsuit. Mm-hmm. It just means what's your ability to fight that lawsuit and rightfully fight that lawsuit. You get somebody who thinks that they're absolutely right, they're going to fight it to the death. They're going to take it to the mat as far as they can because they feel like they're right.
Yeah.
So as a landlord, you should already kind of know, sometimes it doesn't matter whether you are right or wrong or whether you think that you're right or wrong. It's a matter of proving that you're right or wrong.
Sure.
So.
And I think it's important to know too that having a tenant screening criteria for each of your rental properties. So basically it's all the things, the reasons why you might deny somebody to that rental property. If you have somebody who happens, they have an emotional support animal who applies, I'm not saying to use this as a workaround, a loophole, but you stick to whatever your tenant screening criteria is. I mean, perhaps that person can't even, doesn't make enough money in the rent to income ratio. Perhaps they're a smoker and you have a no smoking policy. There are deniable factors that you can work to your advantage in that situation.
Yeah. And you have to be flexible, but it doesn't have to be unreasonable. As a landlord, you still want to make sure that even though this is an emotional support animal and you can't treat it as a pet, let's be honest, at the end of the day, it's still an animal. And there's still rules that animal has to follow, just like humans have to follow rules. So just because it's an emotional support animal or a service animal doesn't mean that you cannot have reasonable rules that apply to the animal's waste or having the animal on a leash. Or
for some reason, when you said waist, the first thing I thought of was like its midsection. Not waste, W-A-S-T-E.
It's a really out of shape dog, and I want it out.
I'm not having a fat dog in my rentals.
Right. No, I mean, I remember when I first got married, my wife and I moved into a place. It was an upper lower, and we had two girls that were living upstairs, and they had a huge golden retriever. And the arrangement that I had made with the landlord was that I would mow the lawns, and I would pay a reduced rent amount because I was mowing the lawn. Well, it got really, really frustrating when I was mowing that lawn and dodging dog poop landmines constantly.
I like to call them lawn muffins.
There you go. Lawn muffins. And this was no small dog, so
Big muffins.
It was a big problem, and I remember just being so frustrated and thinking, you have this animal, take care of it. That includes picking up and I think a lot of people get into that situation where maybe they're a first-time dog owner, maybe they just don't care, who knows, but they don't take care of it, and so you have to have those rules in place so that somebody can't come back to you and say, well, you're discriminating against me because the fact that it's a pet. Well, no, these rules are, or it's an emotional support animal, but these rules are in place regardless.
And according to your blog post, you said that you can still write warnings to the tenant. So if this dog is creating a noise issue, like you said, it's, they're not picking up after it. It's creating property damage or whatever the issues are. You still want to document that. And then after that, you can refuse to allow certain companion animals for undue hardship or expense for the landlord's business. So it's not like you just get a free pass if it's an emotional support animal to just like go buck wild. They still do have rules and regulations that apply.
Right. And and that also applies to the amount of animals that you can have. I remember having a conversation fairly recently with somebody in a very friendly capacity. They were telling me about their emotional support cats, plurally, and they had 4 cats. And I said, that's not reasonable. It's one. Most courts are going to find that one animal per person, per issue. That's what it is. Because you have a one issue or another doesn't mean you can have 4 or 5 cats or, abuse it. So there is limitations on it. It's typically one animal per person.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So from just this podcast, what I'm gathering is if you're a landlord who's dealing with this issue or you just want to be aware of this in case it ever creeps up on you, basically do your homework, tread lightly, don't make any accusations, and be reasonable. And if it really comes down to it and you're not sure what you're going to do, talk to an attorney or somebody who can give you specific advice to follow.
And here's some really good advice if you're a landlord. Let's say that you're trying to fill a unit and you're getting a pretty decent response rate. You put out some ads and you've got 4 people that responded. One of them has an emotional support animal. Do not deny that person on that basis. If you're going to deny them, it better be for a different reason than you have an animal and we have a no pet policy. You're asking for problems. We're on a podcast, so you can't see me winking, and I don't want to come across that way. But if you find other reasons to deny them
that are legit reasons,
then you're okay. You just cannot say, I am denying you because you have this cat, and I don't believe that a person needs a cat to combat anxiety. Then you're opening yourself up to a fight that you're not prepared to handle, for sure.
Yeah, and I think people, we all know those people that they're more attached to their pet than their family even. So when you tell them no on something like this, it's not like a simple oh, okay, I'll deal with it. I'll get rid of the animal. You're possibly dealing with somebody who you just, pretty much said, no, I don't accept your child.
Yeah.
So those are the type of people that are going to go to their wits' end to research this, to figure out how they can make this work and make sure that they're not being treated or discriminated against, I should say.
As a landlord, the best thing you can do is put on your best poker face. When you're talking to that person and they mention that they've got an emotional support animal, don't let it faze you. Okay. And then just move on to the next thing or whatever. If that's something that you're going to consider or think about or freak out about later, let it be later, not in front of that person. Don't even address it at that moment. It's just another part of the conversation. It's not something that I would even address necessarily in that first conversation with the person as I'm qualifying them.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good baseline of knowledge on support animals. So emotional support animals, you have your service animals that are separate classification. Make sure you're distinguishing between the two, and then just do your homework and just make sure you're not getting in some hot water saying something you shouldn't say, that you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube after it's out. Yeah,
and just to, I guess, clarify at closing here, the difference between a support animal and a service animal. A service animal has typically been trained for a specific disability to help them see, to help recognize the early warnings of a seizure or whatever the case may be. An emotional support animal does not need to be trained.
Oh,